She was already running when the convoy stopped. Sergeant First Class Dara Finch heard the engine cut out and knew before the dust settled what it meant. Not a breakdown, not a checkpoint. The kind of silence that arrives when someone has made a decision, and the decision has teeth. The village of Karka Sufla sat at the base of a ridgeline in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, in the particular way that settlements in that part of the country sat, as if the mountains had put them there and could take them back whenever they wanted. Finch had been through it twice before on route clearance. She knew the market stalls, the blue-painted mosque door, the dog that always slept under the water tank near the eastern wall. She'd studied this village the way she studied everything. Not because she'd been told to, but because it was the kind of place where knowing the details was the difference between going home and not. Captain Aldrin was out of the lead vehicle before the dust finished settling. He had the specific walk of a man who had decided the situation was under control and was performing that certainty for the benefit of anyone watching. Finch had been watching him perform it for 7 months. She'd learned early that the performance was not the same thing as the fact. Contact, Aldrin said. Possible IED 200 meters south. He was looking at his map, not at her. He was almost always looking at his map and not at her. Finch was the unit's senior explosive ordnance disposal technician, which meant that the next sentence out of Aldrin's mouth should have been, Sergeant Finch, take point. That was protocol. That was 7 years of training, 2 prior deployments, and a record of cleared devices that she kept in her head because no one else was keeping track of it the way she did. What Aldrin said instead was, Rucker, get up here. Specialist Rucker was 23 years old. He had completed EOD qualification 4 months ago. He was good, genuinely good, with steady hands and a calm that Finch had recognized as the real kind, not the performed kind. But he had 4 months. She had 7 years. In this specific village, on this specific road, with this specific threat profile that she'd read twice in the brief and once again on her own the night before. Because she didn't trust that one reading was enough. Aldrin had just made a decision that was going to matter. She didn't argue. She never argued in the field. She moved to Rucker's position and dropped to one knee next to him, running her eyes down the road surface the way she'd been running her eyes down road surfaces since she was 26 years old, and a staff sergeant named Tillman had told her that the bomb didn't care who you were, but the person who planted it did, and the person who planted it had habits, and habits were the most honest thing about anyone. She saw it before Rucker did. The pressure plate was set just off the crown of the road where a vehicle's left front tire would catch it. Not the center of the road where most drivers looked, but offset, placed by someone who understood that the convoy would drift slightly right to avoid the ditch. Finch clocked the wire run, the direction of the detonator circuit, the depth of the disturbance in the packed clay. 6 seconds of looking, she'd trained for 6 seconds to be enough, because sometimes that was all you got. She put her hand on Rucker's arm and said, quietly, left of crown, offset plate, wire runs northeast toward the culvert. Bypass the culvert first. Rucker looked at her. Then he looked at the road. Then he looked at the culvert. Good eye, Sergeant, he said. They cleared it together. It took 41 minutes. When it was done and the device was rendered safe and the road was open, Aldrin wrote in his report that Specialist Rucker had identified and neutralized a pressure plate IED on Route Bronze, Karki Sufla, and that the operation had proceeded without incident. Finch's name appeared in the report as a supporting element. She read the report that night in the FOB common room. She read it twice, the way she read everything twice. Then she set it down and looked at the ceiling and did the thing she'd trained herself to do, which was to feel the thing fully, for 60 seconds, and then move on, 60 seconds. Then she moved on. This was not the first time. It was not the 5th. She had stopped counting at some point in the previous 18 months, partly because counting made her angry, and anger used resources she couldn't afford, and partly because she had the particular kind of faith that a person develops when they have tested themselves against real conditions long enough to know what they're worth, regardless of what the record says. She knew what she was worth. She was going to keep demonstrating it until the record caught up. 3 weeks later, Aldrin put her on base rotation. Base rotation meant staying inside the wire while the rest of the unit ran route clearance, which was work she'd specifically requested this deployment, work she'd built a case for in writing before they'd left Bagram, citing her IED analysis record and the specific threat matrix for Helmand Province in that operational period. Aldrin had approved the request in transit, initialed the form himself. Then, 3 weeks later, with no explanation she was given in writing, she was on base rotation. She found out why from Rucker, which was not how she should have found out. "Aldrin thinks you make the local assets nervous," Rucker said. His voice had the careful neutrality of someone delivering information they didn't choose to be the messenger for. He said the village elders asked that the female element not conduct dismounted operations in the primary sectors. Finch looked at him. Rucker met her eyes. He didn't look away, which she respected. He was the kind of person who understood that looking away, when you said a hard thing, was a courtesy that didn't actually help anyone. "Was there documentation of that request?" she said. He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She went to Aldrin that afternoon. She did it the right way, through the proper channel, knocked on the doorframe of his office, and waited to be acknowledged, and said, "Sir, I'd like to understand the basis for reassigning me to base rotation." Aldrin looked up from his desk. He had the expression he kept for operational inconveniences, the one that said something was being managed rather than addressed. She'd cataloged that expression over 7 months. She knew exactly what it meant. "Flexibility of deployment," he said. "The mission profile requires it." "Which mission, sir?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The team is performing well. I need you where you can have the most impact." She stood in that office, and she did the math the way she always did the math, not in terms of the argument she couldn't win right now, but in terms of what she was going to do next. She requested the transfer paperwork that evening, not a complaint. A formal transfer request to the Joint EOD Coordination Cell attached to RC South, citing operational justification and her specific qualifications in the regional threat environment. Aldrin denied it the next morning without a meeting. She filed it again through the Sergeant Major's office. Aldrin denied it again and noted in her record that she had demonstrated a pattern of difficulty with assigned roles. That notation went in her file. She didn't find out it was there until 4 months later, and by then it had already cost her something she didn't know she'd been in line for. But that came later. What came first was the village of Hasari Crossing, and what came first at Hasari Crossing was a convoy that should not have been moving on that road on that day with that intelligence picture, and a captain who had decided that the intelligence picture was acceptable because the mission was time-sensitive, and the mission being time-sensitive made the acceptable threshold flexible. Finch was on the third vehicle. She'd been placed there by Aldrin's new formation order, not at the front where her qualifications put her, but at the third position, which was nominally the senior NCO vehicle, but which in practice meant that by the time she identified anything worth identifying, the lead elements would already be on top of it. She'd identified the threat picture 2 days earlier. She'd written it in the pre-mission notes that she prepared for every operation she was involved in, regardless of whether she was asked to prepare them, because she had a standard she held herself to that was entirely independent of what anyone asked of her. The road through Hasari Crossing had 3 historical device placements in the previous 14 months. All 3 had been offset configurations. The last one had been serviced by a cell operating out of the Kala district who had, in the past 6 months, shifted their triggering mechanism from pressure plates to command wire setups with a command post on the eastern ridge. She'd written it in the notes. She'd included the grid reference for the probable observation post. She didn't know if Aldrin read the notes. She'd never seen evidence that he did. They were 200 meters into the main approach when she saw the spotter. He was on the ridgeline, eastern side, which was the grid reference she'd put in the pre-mission notes. And he was moving in the specific, unhurried way that a person moves when they know the timing is controlled by them and not by what's approaching. She keyed her radio. Contact, eastern ridge, possible command wire observer, grid. She gave the grid. Aldrin's voice came back. "Assess and continue. We're 2 minutes from the objective." She was still transmitting the assessment when the lead vehicle's left front wheel crossed a section of that had been surface dressed to hide the disturbance of the wire burial. The device was not a pressure plate. The device was not a pressure plate. The device was command wire, detonated from the ridge by the man she'd been watching when Aldrin told her to continue. The lead vehicle went up on the left side and came down hard, and the sound was the particular sound she'd heard before, and would hear again in the specific way that sounds you associate with catastrophe become permanent residents in your auditory memory, regardless of how many years pass. She was out of her vehicle before the dust resolved itself into something she could see through. She ran toward the lead vehicle, counting. as she went because counting was what kept her grounded in the immediate and the operational, and not in the part of her brain that wanted to stop and absorb what had just happened. 4 personnel in the vehicle. Driver, front passenger, 2 in the rear. She needed 4 status checks. She needed them in the next 30 seconds. She got 2. The driver was conscious, disoriented, face blood but mobile. The front passenger, Corporal Dent, was unconscious with a head injury that she assessed in 6 seconds and classified as serious but survivable with immediate attention. The rear personnel had been thrown clear, both of them, and one was up on one knee, which meant he was functional, and the other one was not moving yet but was breathing. "Rucker," she said when she found him beside the vehicle. "I need you on Corporal Dent, sustained airway management, get a collar on him, and don't move him." She was already moving toward the ridge, not because it was her assignment, because the spotter on the ridge was the thing that needed to stop first, and stopping it was the thing she could do, that nobody else on the ground right now could do as fast or as accurately, and she'd spent 7 years making sure that was true. She had her rifle. She had a ridgeline at approximately 430 meters, with an observer who was almost certainly still up there, because command wire operators typically stayed on position until they confirmed effect, and she'd seen him before the device went, and she knew his position, and she knew the terrain between him and cover. She found a rest on the low rock wall at the road's edge. She adjusted for the elevation, for the upslope angle, for the wind that was pushing left off the ridge face at what she estimated as 8 kilometers per hour, based on the dust movement she'd been tracking since they'd entered the approach. She found him in the scope. He was where she'd expected him, which was exactly where she'd put him in the pre-mission notes, which nobody had read. He was relaying information on a handheld radio. She could see the gestures. He hadn't seen her yet, which meant he hadn't expected someone to break off from the disabled convoy and move toward the ridge on foot. That was a reasonable assumption on his part. It was also wrong. She took the shot on the exhale. 431 meters, upslope, crosswind. The radio traffic from that position stopped. The spotter did not produce any further observations. She held her position for 90 seconds, watching the ridgeline for secondary movement. Nothing came. Then, she went back to the vehicle and finished the casualty assessment. The medevac arrived 26 minutes later. Corporal Dent went out on it with a serious but survivable injury that, 3 weeks later, in a hospital in Germany, he was awake and asking for coffee, which his mother later told Finch in a letter that she kept without fully knowing why she kept it, just that it felt like the kind of document you didn't throw away. Aldrin's after-action report covered the incident in standard operational language. It noted the device type, the mechanism, the casualty count. It noted that the enemy observer on the eastern ridge had been neutralized. It classified the neutralizing action under the heading of unit response without specifying which unit member had taken which action. Finch read the report. She read it twice. She thought about the pre-mission notes she'd filed 2 days before. She thought about the grid reference she'd put in those notes. She thought about Aldrin's voice on the radio saying assess and continue, and the 2 minutes it had taken from that transmission to the front wheel crossing the buried wire. She filed a supplemental action report. She laid it out factually, the way she laid everything out, what she'd observed, what she'd documented in advance, what the timeline showed, what the outcomes were. She attached the pre-mission notes with their timestamp. The supplemental went into the system. She received an automated receipt acknowledgement. She did not hear anything further about it for 11 days. On the 12th day, a major from the Brigade Inspector General's office arrived at FOB Kandar and asked to speak with her privately. His name was Major Vickers, and he had the specific quality of attention that told her he'd read the supplemental report in full and was here because someone above his pay grade had decided that it required a response. She told him what she'd told the supplemental, factually, in sequence. She didn't editorialize. She didn't characterize. She let the timeline speak. Vickers listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions when she finished. Both of them were about documentation. She had documentation for both. He looked at the pre-mission notes. He looked at the timestamp on the supplemental report. He looked at the after-action report's language regarding the Ridge observation post. "How long have you been in EOD?" he said. 7 years, she said. 8 in March. He nodded, wrote something down, did not share what he'd written. "What happens next?" she said, not aggressively. She genuinely wanted to know the process. Vickers looked up. "We look at the record. We look at what the record says and what the physical evidence says, and whether those two things are the same document. He left the next morning. She watched his vehicle clear the gate and then went back to work because the road network wasn't going to assess itself, and there were 4 active sectors with threat profiles that someone had to stay current on. 14 days later, she was called to a video conference with a lieutenant colonel she'd never met before, named Stanhope, who was attached to the theater EOD authority at Kandahar Airfield, and who had apparently been in possession of her supplemental report, her service record, her qualification history, and the pre-mission notes for the past week and a half. Stanhope had the manner of a person who had formed a conclusion and was now conducting the meeting as the final step in a process that was already substantially complete. "I've reviewed your record," Stanhope said, "and I want to understand something. Your initial qualification assessment," here he paused and looked at something off-screen. "Your range scores from Eglin were flagged by your first evaluator as potentially erroneous." He looked back at her. "Did you know that?" She did know that. She'd known it for 8 years. Her scores had been re-administered twice because the first evaluator had decided that the numbers were impossible for a soldier of her profile, which was a word that had meant something specific in that context, and that she'd understood very clearly at 22 years old, even if she hadn't yet had the vocabulary for it. "I was retested twice," she said. "The scores were confirmed both times." "I'm aware of that," Stanhope said. "I'm also aware that your current unit record contains a notation regarding difficulty with assigned roles. I want to give you an opportunity to speak to that notation directly." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "The notation was filed by Captain Aldrin following my formal transfer request, which I filed after being assigned to base rotation in circumstances that I have documented separately. I'd encourage you to read the transfer request and the denial and the timeline of the notation in sequence, because the sequence tells a different story than the notation does in isolation." Stanhope looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough to be deliberate. "I've read them in sequence," he said. "That's why we're having this call." What followed was 32 minutes that she would remember for a long time, not because she'd expected the outcome, but because of the particular quality of being fully heard by someone with authority for the first time, in a context where it mattered operationally. Stanhope asked precise questions. He listened to the precise answers. He did not perform skepticism or reassurance. He did the thing that she did, which was to let the information determine the shape of the conclusion, rather than bringing the conclusion and asking the information to fit it. When the call ended, he said, "I'll be in contact within 72 hours. Sergeant Finch." And the way he said the name and the rank together had a weight to it that she understood meant something, without yet being able to say exactly what. She went back to work. There was still a threat matrix to update, and a road network to assess, and a unit that needed what she'd always given it, regardless of whether the unit's formal record acknowledged the giving. The contact came in 48 hours, not 72. It was not Stanhope. It was a colonel she'd never spoken to before, attached to the Joint Special Operations EOD advisory element at a location she wasn't told, and the colonel's name was Sanderson. And Colonel Sanderson had a directness that Finch found immediately clarifying in the way that direct people always are when you've been spending time with people who aren't. "We have a situation," Sanderson said, "and I want to tell you plainly what it is and what I'm asking you to consider." Finch listened. The situation was a compound in Ghazni province. The situation was a network of devices whose configuration didn't match any active cell's documented signature, which meant either a new cell or an advisor, and both possibilities were worse than what they'd been dealing with in Helmand. The situation was 3 incidents in 6 weeks, where disposal teams had encountered devices with secondary configurations they hadn't anticipated because the primary analysis had been incomplete, and the secondary configurations had produced outcomes that were going to affect those teams for a long time. The situation was also an advisory element that needed a technical specialist with a specific kind of pattern recognition, the kind that comes from doing the analysis long enough and seriously enough that the habits of the people who build the devices become legible to you the way a person's handwriting becomes legible when you've read enough of it. "I've read your pre-mission notes from Hasari Crossing," Sanderson said, "and I've read the device analysis from your previous deployment, and I've read your range records from Eglin. All 3 of them." She paused. I'm asking if you're willing to deploy forward to Ghazni on a 90-day advisory attachment, independent operation, direct reporting to my office. No lateral chain of command. Finch looked at the wall of the room she was sitting in for a moment. Then she said, "What's the threat profile?" Sanderson told her. It was not simple. It was the kind of profile that required the specific combination of things she had, which she knew, which was why the call was happening. "When can I have the full device analysis from the 3 incidents?" Finch said. "I can have it to you in 4 hours. Give me 24 hours with it," she said. "Then I'll give you my assessment of what we're dealing with and what I'd need to address it." Sanderson was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most people I ask that question, they just say yes." "I'm not saying no," Finch said. "I'm saying I want to read the record before I commit to a position. That's not how I approach things." Another moment. "Good," Sanderson said. The analysis came through in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Finch read it that night. She read the device photographs, the wire diagrams, the soil disturbance reports, the incident timelines. She read the secondary configuration that nobody had anticipated. She read it the way she read everything, not to confirm what she already thought, but to let it tell her what it actually said. She slept 4 hours, woke up, read it again. At 0600, she wrote 11 pages of technical notes covering the probable device architecture, the signature elements that connected the 3 incidents to a common source, the 2 anomalies that suggested the source had a specific kind of training she could identify and probably narrow, and the 3 things the disposal teams had done in sequence that had activated the secondary configurations in each case. She attached a recommended protocol for the Ghazni environment, 14 points, specific, operational, based entirely on what the record said rather than on what anyone had assumed going in. She transmitted it to Sanderson at 0618. Sanderson called her at 0741. "How long?" Sanderson said without preamble. "How long have you been doing this level of analysis?" "My first deployment," Finch said. "Who authorized you to do it?" "No one," she said. "I did it because it needed doing." Silence on the line. The kind of silence that means someone is recalibrating something rather than simply pausing. "The notation in your record," Sanderson said. "Difficulty with assigned roles. I want to make sure I understand what that means in context." "It means I documented things my chain of command didn't ask me to document," Finch said. "And I filed reports that contradicted the official record. And I requested a transfer when I was removed from the operational role I'd been specifically approved for." She paused. "If that's difficulty, then yes, that's accurate," Sanderson said. "The notation is being reviewed. That's all I can tell you right now. What I can tell you is that the analysis you sent me this morning is the most operationally useful thing I've received in this theater in the past 4 months, and I've been in this theater for 19 months. Finch held the phone. She let that land. She didn't deflect it or minimize it. She let it sit where it was. Then, "When do you need me in Ghazni?" The advisory element operated out of a small compound attached to an Afghan National Army facility in Ghazni City. It was 6 people when she arrived, 5 of them male, all of them senior NCOs or warrants with multiple deployments, the kind of unit that had its own culture so thoroughly established that a new element arriving felt the edges of it immediately. She felt the edges. She didn't perform not feeling them. The element's senior warrant, a man named Torrance, met her at the gate with the particular expression of someone who'd been told a specialist was arriving and had formed a picture of what that meant before the specialist showed up. She'd seen that expression before. She'd developed a specific response to it, which was to spend the first 48 hours doing the things she did well and letting the doing be the introduction. She spent the first 48 hours reading the full device archive for Ghazni province going back 2 years. She didn't ask for help accessing it. She found the system, learned its structure, extracted what she needed. She read it the way she read everything. On the 3rd morning, she put the analysis on the table in the operations room, not a summary. The full technical picture with the 12-point addendum covering what she assessed as the probable shift in the cell's construction methodology over the previous 4 months and why that shift suggested a specific kind of supply change that should be detectable in the provincial market network if someone was looking for it. Torrance read it. He read it twice. She watched him read it the second time with the particular attention of someone who had found something they weren't expecting and was making sure they were reading it correctly. "Who built this?" he said. She looked at him. "Right," he said. He set the document down. He looked at the map on the wall, and then at the document, and then at her. "You've been here 3 days." 78 hours, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the three incidents, the secondary configurations. He looked at the analysis. You're saying this wasn't a separate design. You're saying the secondary was intentional to the primary from the beginning. Yes, she said, the primary was the bait, the secondary was the point. They've been learning from each incident what our response protocol looks like, and they've been adjusting the secondary to exploit the next step in the protocol, which means the next device we encounter will have a tertiary element, she said, because the secondary has been fully compromised by this point, and they know it. She watched him process that. It was the kind of information that took a moment to fully land because it required revising an assumption that had felt stable. What do we do about it? Torrance said. We change the protocol before the next encounter, she said, and we find the supply chain disruption I identified in Section 9. Because that's the only lever we have that doesn't require us to encounter another device to learn something. Torrance was quiet again. The element's other members had come into the operations room during the last part of the conversation. She was aware of them the way she was always aware of who was in a space and where. Nobody was talking. Then Torrance said, all right, and walk us through Section 9. She walked them through Section 9. 3 weeks into the Ghazni attachment, the Provincial Intelligence Cell flagged an anomaly in the construction materials moving through the Nawa market network. It matched, specifically and documentably, the supply indicator she'd identified in the analysis. Torrance sent the flag up to Sanderson's office and copied Finch. Sanderson called her the same day. She'd heard you, Finch said later. Not to anyone in particular, just as a fact she was still processing. She had read the analysis and heard the thing in it, and then the thing had turned out to be real. And Sanderson had called her because when the thing you predicted shows up in the world, the person who predicted it is the person you call. The source of the materials was a logistics contact who had access to both the provincial supply network and to a specific compound in the Ghazni City District that had, until the supply flag, been a building on a map rather than an address with operational significance. The compound held 3 people with specific technical knowledge. It also held, in a locked room that the element found on day 2 of the clearance operation, a bench with tools and components, and a notebook with diagrams that Finch recognized on sight as the design language of the devices she'd been reading for the past 8 years. She stood in that room for a long time. Torrance stood beside her and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do. The notebook went to the intelligence unit in Kandahar. The analysis of it, which Finch provided over the next 4 days in 37 pages of technical notes and diagram annotations, went to the Theater EOD Authority and then further up a chain she was never fully briefed on, but whose existence she understood from the way the questions coming back to her shifted in specificity and depth over the following 2 weeks. Sanderson called her on the 14th day. You've been nominated, Sanderson said, for a meritorious service citation, theater level. The nomination covers the Hasari Crossing supplemental report, the Ghazni analysis, and the compound clearance contributions. Finch looked at the operations room, the map, the pins. There's something else, Sanderson said, and her voice had shifted the way it did when she was moving from one kind of conversation to another. The notation in your record, difficulty with assigned roles. Inspector General completed the review this week. Finch waited. It's being removed, Sanderson said, with a formal finding that it was filed without operational basis and in a context that the review characterized as inappropriate command response to a protected personnel action. She let that land. There's more, Sanderson said. The review found a pattern, not just the notation, the transfer denial, the role reassignment, the after-action report language after Hasari Crossing. The IG's finding is that Captain Aldrin systematically excluded your contributions from the formal record and restricted your operational role in a manner inconsistent with your qualifications and with documented unit need. What happens to Aldrin? Finch said. He's being relieved of command, Sanderson said. Formal process, not discretionary. The investigation is active. The room was very quiet. Outside she could hear the compound's generator, and somewhere further away, the sound of a vehicle working its way through the city, and the normal sounds of a place that was carrying on, regardless of what was happening in this particular room. She thought about the after-action report that had listed Rucker's name and hers as supporting element. She thought about the base rotation order and the transfer denial and the notation that had sat in her file for months, accumulating the specific weight that things accumulate when they go unaddressed. She thought about Corporal Dent in a hospital in Germany, asking for coffee. She thought about the notebook in the locked room and the handwriting in it that she'd recognized the way you recognize a voice you've been listening to for a long time without ever having met the person. She thought about the 60 seconds she'd given herself, the night of the first after-action report. 60 seconds to feel it, then move on. She'd moved on a lot of times. Each time the ground had felt slightly less stable than the time before, in the way that structures feel when they've absorbed repeated stress without a chance to be assessed and repaired. She'd managed it because managing it was the job, and the job was what she had. She had more now. Colonel Sanderson, she said, the remaining cells, the network behind the compound, the notebook diagrams connected to at least 2 operational signatures I haven't been able to source yet. I want to stay on it. I know that too, Sanderson said. That's the other reason I called. She paused. We're building a dedicated technical advisory cell for the theater EOD network, direct reporting, full operational access to the device archive across all provincial commands. It will require a promotion board review, but the recommendation is already submitted and the board is a formality at this point. She paused again. Sergeant Finch, I want you to lead it. She looked at the map, the pins, the lines between the things she knew and the things she didn't know yet. What's the mandate? She said. Find them, Sanderson said. All of them, the ones we know and the ones we don't know yet. Build the analysis picture that makes the network legible. You've been doing it in pieces for 8 years. Now you do it as the whole job. Finch thought about 8 years of pre-mission notes that nobody had asked her to write. 8 years of range scores that had been checked twice because the numbers seemed impossible. 8 years of after-action reports that attributed her work to the unit in aggregate, as though the specific person doing the specific thing at the specific moment didn't matter. It had mattered. It always mattered. She'd known that the way she knew everything she'd decided to know, which was by testing it against conditions and finding that it held. Yes, she said. The same word she'd always used for the things that mattered. Clean and direct and without the need to explain itself. She was still at the map when Torrance came to the operations room an hour later. He looked at her. She looked staying, he said. Changed in form, she said. Same work. He nodded. He looked at the map, the pins, the lines. Section 9, he said. There were 3 more indicators I was going to flag tomorrow. She turned from the map. Show me.